the virus outbreak has already spread to 20 mainland cities and that thousands of people could already be infected.
It is absolutely critical that public health recognize a super spreading event in the very earliest stages before it goes absolutely explosive.
Tonight, the CDC says the first confirmed U.S. case of the contagious coronavirus now in Washington state. When the American arrived, he showed no symptoms. With emergency measures being taken to stop the spread in China, the death toll from coronavirus has doubled to 6 as the number of confirmed cases soars to some 300.
We started tracking the news from China early on, and what concerned me as an emergency department director and physician was that the asymptomatic phase of the viral infection rendered our infection control protocols ineffective.
Drastic measures to halt the spread of that deadly virus. Wuhan, China, ground zero for the outbreak, now under lockdown. The city of 11 million now halting all public transportation and outbound flights.
What do we have?
2 med-surg, 3 tele, and actually 1 ICU and 1 CCU.
So which is the COVID floor? The CCU? We have the CCU bed. When China locked Wuhan down, I started preparing the 5 emergency departments I manage for the worst. I was responsible for preparing over 400 doctors, nurses, and physician assistants for what would be the greatest challenge of our lives.
Scientists around the world are meeting in Geneva to discuss ways to combat the new coronavirus. One step forward, the virus has been officially named as COVID-19. It doesn't stigmatize people or places. The chief of the World Health Organization said there is still a chance of containing it if enough resources are devoted to the fight.
A virus can have more powerful consequences than any terrorist action.
When we learned that this was a new coronavirus, we started having almost daily staff meetings among hospital administrators, physicians, and nurses in order to plan for the coming pandemic. In the emergency department, we adopted a strategy of masking 24/7 in the clinical areas almost from the beginning. For EMS arrivals, we've been concerned that there's some doctors who want to wear PAPRs and some doctors who want to wear masks, and we need to get some consistency. So the problem is that you can't hear very well in the PAPRs. So do we want to say N95s and goggles and gowns and gloves for everyone? Is that kind of what we're thinking?
Yeah.
The coronavirus is spreading fast and beyond China, spiking in South Korea this week.
And while we deal with the growing emergency here at home, for many, the crisis is already in full swing.
So far, at least 81 countries have reported cases. 95,000 people or more have been infected worldwide, and at least 3,200 of them have died. Italy's government has closed all schools in the country.
Breaking news. The first death from coronavirus here in the United States. A man in his 50s dying from COVID-19 infection. President Trump and his team confirming the fatality and warning Americans not to panic.
By the time San Francisco had declared a state of emergency, we had gotten reports throughout the world that COVID-19 had a distinct asymptomatic contagious phase. This represented a unique problem for us since all our infectious disease protocols were based on identifying at-risk patients in triage. This required us to rapidly expand the footprint of the emergency department to include these respiratory tents so that we could isolate patients and keep other patients and staff members safe.
For the first time, the World Health Organization declaring the outbreak of COVID-19 a global pandemic.
We're going to begin tonight with breaking news. The president declaring a national emergency, which he says will unleash the power of the federal government to combat the coronavirus pandemic.
Is Air Medical taking anybody?
They are. So any positive COVID patient they'll take. Intubated is always more preferable.
All right, so everyone's feeling pretty secure about that.
Yeah.
All right.
The city of New Orleans is fast becoming a global hotspot for the virus.
giving it the highest death rate in the nation, almost 4 times that of New York.
From New York, we go to California now. The nation's most populous state and the world's 5th largest economy is in shutdown mode.
Your breathing looks a little bit worse there. So I think what we're going to have to do is try you on the machine here to see if we can support your breathing.
Okay.
Okay? Personal supportive care has been the key to saving lives during the COVID pandemic. Unfortunately, large for-profit healthcare systems have been reducing the staff per patient ratio for years. I feel very lucky to be working in this emergency department where I can provide personalized care. Okay, so just hang out there for a little bit and I'll come back and see how you're doing. Here we are, it's March 26th. The U.S. has the highest number of COVID patients in the world. As a medical director, my primary concern is keeping the doctors and nurses infection-free, because if one of them goes down, that affects hundreds of patients. I had to tell the hospital administrators that if they didn't follow the emergency department recommendations for masking and someone got sick, good luck. I have to admit that some of my own colleagues weren't 100% on board. I just came back from San Francisco and finished organizing all our protocols there. And when I got back to Los Alamos, nobody was wearing masks, and I kind of went ballistic at my colleagues. There was a false sense of safety, and I think many people were feeling it in rural areas across the country. It seemed especially true here in Los Alamos, in the high desert of New Mexico where the government had developed the atom bomb. It was hard to imagine being vulnerable to a virus that was thousands of miles away. And so we ended up being underprepared. I had a long conversation with the assistant director at Los Alamos Emergency Department about masking and other protocols. And it was in that conversation that I think I infected him with COVID-19. At the time, I felt perfectly fine, and I didn't have any idea how sick I was about to become. So I think I got COVID on this very couch. I think when you and I were hanging out on the couch for about an hour, 2 or 3 days before you got symptoms is when the transmission occurred.
And I got it from my girlfriend, Billy, who had no symptoms. And when I had it, I only had a pretty bad fever for about a day, and that's it. And I kind of just thought it was a flu or a cold or something.
But I could tell you had way more than a flu or cold or something, because you were getting increasingly more withdrawn. You were going downhill. 5 or 6 days in, your mood really shifted significantly, and that really made me scared.
And right when that was starting to happen, we decided that we should probably take you to the hospital up to Los Alamos because Mom was nervous about you sleeping through the night and yada, yada, yada. And so we pretty much forced you to go.
I mean, essentially kicking and screaming.
It was an intervention.
Yeah, I didn't want to go. I had spent years in hospitals on overnight shifts and 24-hour shifts, and I had a kind of PTSD about all the loneliness associated with that. And during the COVID epidemic, I knew I was going to be completely alone. My family didn't want to be responsible if my condition at home worsened. I knew that at that point during the pandemic, there was not much a hospital could do for the COVID-19 infections. I also knew that given the protocols that I had put in place, that I would remain in isolation during my hospital stay. The next morning, I pushed so that I could get home as soon as possible. As I became sicker, I retreated further and further in quarantine into the guest house. The weird thing about COVID is that for part of the day, you feel well, as if you're gonna be on the road to recovery. Then all of a sudden, your fever comes back, you feel weak, you can't move, you feel just as sick or worse than you ever have before. And this cycle repeats itself day after day. It did become manageable, however, with use of oxygen and Tylenol. Then all of a sudden, I began to experience searing chest pain every time I took a breath. My back began to spasm and I couldn't get in a comfortable position. My heart began to race.
We thought with the oxygen therapy we were trying to do at home that we had this under control. But as the days passed, we realized Josiah had become a shell of himself. When the back spasms got really acute, I got really scared. And then Josiah really screamed that he needed to get to the local hospital as quickly as possible. So we called the ambulance, but got really concerned that the ambulance wouldn't get here in time. When Sam and Josiah got sick, I had a sense of inevitability. I thought it was probably likely we were all going to get COVID, and it really scared me. It also reminded me of being in Uganda probably 20 years ago, working in public health as the Ebola outbreak started. And I looked up one day and saw a piece of cardboard tacked to a tree that said Ebola 20 kilometers from here. And I thought, wow, that is great public health messaging. And let's get the hell out of here. I realize with the COVID pandemic, that little piece of cardboard is everywhere. There's no place to go.
I can start to feel a fever come on, and I know when that happens, my oxygen saturation is going to drop with the increased metabolic demands of the fever. Plus, I've got the symptoms of the pulmonary embolism, and I'm coughing up blood. I asked the nurse for some Tylenol, but my physician hadn't ordered it. I asked for it a couple times, so much so that the nurse finally just shut the door, and I was left here waiting. Even though we'd made progress adapting hospital systems to the pandemic, as a patient, I had to confront the truth that the age-old bureaucracy was alive and well. And here I was, a patient captive inside the system. My son Sam smuggled in some Tylenol for me, and with it, some salty, delicious mushroom soup. Unfortunately, because of my leaky lungs, I soon began frothing at the mouth from the salt. At that point, 80% of patients who've been placed on a ventilator ended up dying, and the gentleman in the room next to me had just been placed on one. In my own feverish mind, I figured with the pulmonary embolism and the frothing at the mouth, I had still about a 30% chance to live. At that point, I thought those were pretty good numbers, but I know Mary, now my wife, didn't see it that way.
Tonight, over 14,000 now dead in the U.S. from coronavirus. The deadliest day yet in New York, nearly 800 lives lost in 24 hours. Also, the growing crisis at nursing homes, one under urgent evacuation.
All right, Mr. Child, I want you to keep your arms straight. The machine is going to talk to you. It's going to say, stop breathing. Try not to inhale and stop breathing. Just stop where you're at. Do you have any questions? No. We're going to begin.
As my symptoms escalated, I was feeling a kind of terror, like falling off a bicycle.
Breathe.
Everything was in slow motion, and I knew that I was crashing.
Breathe in. Hold your breath.
A coldly rational doctor's mindset took over
Breathe.
as I observed the events unfold.
Hold your breath.
But it was almost like I was in a state of paralysis, unable to intervene.
Breathe in. Hold your breath.
After I was diagnosed with the pulmonary embolism, I started coughing up blood every few hours. I knew intellectually that the right treatment for this was a blood thinner, but I also knew that some patients end up bleeding into their lungs. I was scared, but I was also so exhausted that the whole thing started to blur together.
Josiah asked his physician to send me a copy of his CT scan for a second opinion. As a radiologist, it's my job to look inside people to diagnose disease. Looking inside a friend and colleague is especially tough. It was early April. I hadn't seen too many COVID patient CT scans yet. I had been studying the literature and expected to see signs of pneumonia and inflammation, which I certainly did. But what really shocked me was the severity of disease I was seeing in Josiah's chest. The yellow structures you're seeing here are pulmonary emboli, which are clots lodged in the arteries of his lungs. These clots had formed in Josiah's legs, traveled through his heart, and are blocking the vessels that bring blood to his lungs. His normally healthy, spongy lung tissue was necrotizing, dying, and turning into a soupy stew of blood, mucus, and dead tissue. This mess is what he was coughing up in the hospital. Josiah's heart was a major cause of concern for me, because while his lung function was rapidly diminishing, his heart was becoming strained, which put him at a risk for heart attack. I could only imagine the severity of sharp, stabbing chest pain that Josiah was experiencing, on top of the shortness of breath. While the blood clots were of grave concern, this pulmonary inflammation represented in orange put Josiah in danger of respiratory failure, which is what kills most of the patients who die from COVID-19. This is known as lung consolidation, a state in which no air exchange takes place and the patient can literally suffocate. The last thing Josiah and I reviewed was the small calcification in his left main coronary artery. The rest of his heart looked pretty good, which was a bit of good news given the extent of bad news with the lung disease, the pulmonary emboli. Seeing all of this horrible disease brought about by COVID was very concerning in a friend and colleague, and I was really quite worried about him.
Although I had amazing doctors and nurses caring for me, the hospital can be a lonely place. But when Steve Abaddon took me through my CAT scan, the care that he took made me feel cared for in some strange way from the inside, and it was a very profound feeling.
coming back from college in the beginning wasn't that bad just because I got to spend time with my family and friends. And then all of a sudden I was having to balance classes over Zoom and being a caretaker of the family. And then once Dad started to get better, Mom started to get worse. And then I kept thinking in the back of my head, like, when am I gonna get COVID if they've all had it or have it?
And for me, a moment that really sticks out is going from watching COVID unfold on the TV all over the world to seeing it unfold in our living room. And it felt really surreal to me to be at the heart of this novel virus that we knew nothing about at the time.
It was a weird time. COVID was getting so much attention in the media while we were living it. And I was getting really worried as I got sicker, hoping that I wasn't going down the same path Joe had just come from. And now I look back on that period of time a little bewildered, but with a lot of relief that we're all fine, and in some weird way, this virus has brought us closer together.
As I started to recover, I continued to work with other doctors throughout the world. We worked at a round-the-clock, feverish pace in order to try and find solutions to the various problems that the pandemic presented. It was an amazing time to be a physician, and I think we'll always remember this period of time because we were able to find solutions to keep people safe at a speed which has never been seen before.
Viruses are difficult to understand. It's almost as if they live in a world of ideas. And during a pandemic, this world is laced with fear. Scientists estimate that there are more SARS-CoV-2 virus particles on Earth than there are stars in the sky. 100 years ago, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic killed almost 700,000 Americans and at least 20 million people worldwide. The extent and depth of the suffering we experienced then has almost completely been forgotten. And what many people don't realize is that the Spanish flu is still with us today as one of the many strains of the seasonal flu. Even if we could easily pinpoint infected people, which we can't, most infections are transmitted by either pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic carriers. People tend to revolt against wearing masks when they believe they are not sick. But in order to contain the virus, we need to overcompensate and create a sort of religion around wearing masks and social distancing. One thing that hospitals have in common across the country is that they weren't built to isolate large numbers of patients and staff.
So now I'm going to swab you. It's going to be a little bit uncomfortable.
Okay.
Okay.
Emergency departments are using respiratory tents like this one to keep patients separated while they're being evaluated. This is a simple and effective way to provide access to medical care while keeping staff and patients safe.
Now to the aspect of the crisis continuing to capture so much attention, that ventilator shortage. Red alerts across the country as officials and healthcare workers scramble for ways to increase the supply of that life-saving equipment.
One of the great failures of the pandemic was that back in March, we believed COVID-19 was similar to other respiratory illnesses. So when patients went into respiratory distress, we put them on ventilators. This meant paralyzing them, sticking a plastic tube down their throat, and using the ventilator to force air into their lungs.
The idea was you would take a intubation tube such as this, or ET tube, pass it through the patient's mouth, past the vocal cords and into the larynx, and then blow up this balloon. The idea was this balloon would prevent virions in the lungs from infecting the room and other staff members. Unfortunately, patients didn't do very well on ventilators with COVID, and New York City saw a mortality rate something like 80%. The reason why we didn't use bridging techniques such as CPAP or BiPAP was that if you place the patient on a mask, when they breathed out, the virions would theoretically pass through this expiratory port and infect staff members. An emergency physician noticed, however, that we have many viral filters in a hospital that we use to protect ventilators, and that if you place it on the expiratory port, you could also now protect staff members.
This non-invasive approach was greeted with great controversy throughout the country. But once adopted, the so-called ventilator shortage disappeared within weeks. As doctors working on the front lines, we expected the CDC to provide expert guidance and leadership throughout the pandemic. And we were surprised and often shocked to find that we were weeks and months ahead of their recommendations. The US government's failure to execute a coherent strategy is a reason why we see no end in sight to this pandemic.
As we come on the air tonight, more than 200,000 people in the U.S. have now been killed by the virus. 200,000 lives lost, 200,000 stories left unfinished.
The idea of 200,000 deaths is really very sobering and in some respects stunning. We can't throw our hands up and say, it's hopeless, it's going to happen anyway. That is unacceptable to take that approach. It's always the balance of trying not to frighten people at the same time of trying to jolt them into a realization of what needs to be done to protect themselves as individuals and the country. One of the things that the public needs to understand is that this is an evolving situation. So we need to put that nonsense behind us about, well, they keep changing their minds. Masks work, physical distancing works, avoiding crowds work. This is where we are, and it's based on fact.
Dr. Robert Gallo and Dr. Anthony Fauci were the kind of elders in the House of Medicine that we in the front lines turn to, if not necessarily for answers, at least for perspective as to how to navigate this pandemic. Elders in society have always filled this role, and I can only imagine that when society faces its next crisis, that we who lived on the front lines of this one will be turned to by the men and women on the front lines of the next one for some kind of perspective. And I only hope that we can provide that. Does she have trouble remembering stuff?
Yeah.
Can she like walk up a flight of stairs?
Nope. She cannot read. And I said, you are short of breath. And she said, no, I'm not. Girl, I've been a nurse too long and I know that sound. You're struggling. People seem to think that, oh, well, you know, you'll bounce back, you'll come back tomorrow. It's like, so I'm not IT. People who weren't intubated are struggling to come back to work. So I knew she wasn't going to be.
Yeah.
No spring chicken jumping around here.
Yeah. No. Mm-mm. I mean, I worked really hard at it. I was like 3 hours a day. It was exercising and getting back in shape.
Yeah. And she's doing physical therapy, but I'm afraid that if Shaq can go to the doctor, that I'm gonna find her dead in that apartment.
Mm-hmm.
All 8 billion of us are faced with a crisis that escapes simple answers. Humanity will survive this pandemic. It's just a question of the extent of death and suffering we will experience in order to get there.
Emergency eviction moratoriums run out. Millions of Americans are now in limbo as they struggle to maintain a roof over their head.
The government is warning that the financial damage caused by the pandemic will last for years.
This pandemic highlights that those in the margins pay the heaviest price, as they have throughout history.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice!
The pandemic is forcing us to reckon with social and economic systems collapsing before our eyes.
Crews working around the clock to get a handle on some of the largest fires in state history.
Migratory birds are dropping dead in alarming numbers.
A city submerged, Houston underwater, cars and trucks stranded on miles of flooded roads.
We think of breath as being the essence of life. But right now, it can be a vehicle for transmitting a lethal virus. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us the reality of how interconnected and fragile our lives really are.
Honestly, I think a combination of desperation and imagination sometimes brings out the best in people. I know I became a physician because handling crisis, I thought, brought out the best in me. Prior to this pandemic, I think the House of Medicine had fallen asleep. But as the crisis spread throughout the globe, thinking minds throughout medicine started working together and disseminating information at a speed never before seen in human history. I know for me personally, it brought out some of the best qualities in myself. I was able to think deeply and clearly and provide leadership that I hadn't been able to do before. And maybe that's the lesson of this pandemic.